The discussion in part one on how representative democracy emerged as a modern form of government and on its main principles raised further questions during the workshop. How to reconcile the delegation of power typical of representative government with the idea of the rule of the people at the center of democracy, and how to see the role of elections in representative democracy. In the second part of our conversation, Nadia Urbinati and Céline Spector addressed these problems in turn, starting from the question posed to them that thinkers like Rousseau and Kant saw representation and democracy as very different principles of government.
Thank you, because this was a problem through which I started when I wrote about representation the first time. This idea, you mentioned Kant of Rousseau. The judgment becomes relevant here, not simply decisions. So not simply the moment in which we nominate, we elect, we authorize, but it is the judgment issues here that is relevant, that is representative. Regardless of who is the agents, so the distinction between, sovereignty and who operates inside of, what it counts in that, it is that a law, thus a decision, can reflect the judgment of the sovereign, that is we. At this point, representation becomes connected also to all institutions, to justice, to bureaucracy, is not longer connected to the action of the citizen to indicate or to authorize somebody. It becomes the entire state or the entire republic becomes representative of. For this reason, I wouldn't consider that parts of the democratic trajectory, perhaps they are part of the constitutional trajectory of a democratization process in representation. Sorry.
That's fine. Céline.
Yes, I would like also to come back just 1 second to Rousseau, because it's a little bit, I think, more complex than we usually present it. First, of course, for Rousseau, sovereignty cannot be represented. That's the basis. But on the other hand, as you know, there are two moments that can be very well, in a way, represented. Well, first, the lawgiver, of course, he's not a trustee, but still, he's not a delegate, but still, he will actually draft the law. And second, on the other side, the government, of course, Rousseau is no Democrat. He criticizes very deeply democracy and distinguishes the republic from democracy by the fact that the government actually will be like a representative. And Rousseau is very fine with the representation of executive power and with the fact that actually power should be separated at this level. And third point, which is really important, I think we should not only look at the social contract or even at the text on Poland, where Rousseau comes back to the idea of binding instructions and an imperative mandate. We should also look at the letters written from the mountain, because there actually Rousseau sides with what we called in Geneva the représentants. And actually the représentants were against, the big families like Tronchin, the aristocrats in Geneva. And the représentants were actually defending another kind of representation, which was like kind of a petition that could be addressed to the governance and that had to be taken into account. So actually, I think it would be interesting also to read more closely, for instance, letters 8 and 9, of the letters written from the mountain, because there Rousseau actually comes back to the English model against Tronchin, and they both fight on Montesquieu. And there you can find a more interesting view about the actual exercise of legislative power. And Rousseau is more surprising than we think. Maybe one word on Kant. Kant, I think, cannot be understood after Rousseau, more after Montesquieu, because separation of powers actually in Kant is really has all the levels of even the legislative power has to be represented. So,
if I have, may I simply add? I of course, Céline, she's an expert on that, so I don't want to discuss. But what is the meaning of representation? Because when in chapter 15. Book 3, he makes this argument of
deputies.
they are not the same thing as a representation. So, of course, there is somebody doing things instead of, but the relationship is not one of authorizations by the citizens. So in this sense, it is an institutional conception. We need to have servants like master. So the sovereign is like a master, needs to have servants, but without authorizing them to use the will of the sovereign. In some sense, they are executioner of the will. So that, I would say, is a delegation fine, but not representation. So I don't know. Perhaps
it's a difficult issue because it depends whether Rousseau only speaks about like the medieval model of representation, or if he also has in mind the English model, because he quotes the English and saying that, so this is really the modern model of representation grounded on election, not only the feudal one. So I would tend to say that Rousseau is also against the second version of representation, not only the first one.
Let me take the example of the elections. The elections very often are because, like what Manan called the distinction principle, they are taken to be a form of selections, which in some way, for its in its nature, seem to push towards a more elitarian, divisional labor, aristocratic form of government. On the other hand, and I think that was, if I understood correctly what you were saying, Nadia, that now, it's election add a value of democratization, partly connect to the fact that in some way they are an expression of a kind of form of consent and authorization, which in this case may also link to the natural law idea of natural rights and so on and so forth, or also to the question, the importance of the autonomy or the self-governing kind that also Céline was referring even in Montesquieu. So there is a kind of tension there. The elections become a moment where people may feel they are in power. At the same time, it's an instrument which actually is typical of the division of labor, and therefore, in some way. So I don't think one can solve this issue just in abstract, frankly. I think that actually this issue is then in some way used either during particular kind of political moment, institutional moment, as a form of directing representative democracy in one direction or the other. So that is one problem I would like to pose.
In fact, this is the interpretation of elections that, in my view, should interest us a lot, because it's not the same through the centuries. So for this, for instance, why elections is interpreted as selection, right? Selection of individuals. In the 19th century was considered, or even more close to us, it was considered a way of constructing a constituency to go to the parliament, or to select or to send a representative in the parliament, but not selections of individuals as if it were a fight between individual kings or individual magistrates. So this idea, it's come to us somehow, well, the process is long, but recently, certainly Schumpeter is important, because for him, democracy is simply a system for selecting an elite to govern. Selections does. So, of course, you want to have, as he says, a competent elite, so that it's not simply selecting. So selections go with competence or salience, somebody that is different from us, better than us. So that is a very anti-democratic interpretation of selections, that in order to make this argument strong, there was also a kind of reappropriation of ancient history in order to make it functional to these interpretations. So, for instance, using only Aristotle, because only Aristotle de facto has this identification of elections with the aristocracy in his politics. You don't find these identifications of elections and aristocracy elsewhere. So there is an ideological constructions of the meaning of elections. Thus, in relation to that, we have to perhaps think in terms of the role of elite or the competence, because this is what, as we know, the enemy of democracy is competence. If you want to attack democracy, equality of votes, equal, and it's by claiming that you need competence to rule. You cannot. So competence does as an anti-democratic functions, and elections is a way of justifying these functions by associating it to consent, or we consent to be governed by those who we select because they are the more competent. So it's a kind of tricky, the interpretation of elections.
Yes, I totally agree. And I would say that clearly election is not a mere institutional mechanism. It's not only a one-to-one relation between a constituency and its agent. So I agree with you, Dario, that, you know, it's a social institution. It's embedded in social practices. And I think, for instance, we should go back also to 17th century England. Even if there was a lot of corruption in 17th century England, a lot of corrupt boroughs, rotten boroughs, and people who actually sold their votes. But still, what was interesting at that time was that the voters did not only vote, actually. They discussed very much in inns and clubs, in fairs, in marketplaces. So basically, the whole activity around election was huge. They participated in the Green Ribbon Club, for instance, and even Shaftesbury, actually, Locke's mentor, in a way, in politics, actually frequented merchants, shopkeepers, really people that were very low in society. And basically, there was all this political activism that I think we forgot, thinking that elections were very, you know, like a very, very quiet moment. Actually, it was not uprising, but almost. I mean, they were trying to have this revolutionary politics, like Ashcraft said. So basically, election was a democratic moment